Next bill under consideration is Senate Bill 2336. Madam Secretary.
Senate Bill 2336, a bill for an act to amend and reenact Section 57-51.1-02 of the North Dakota Century Code relating to the oil extraction tax rate and to provide an effective date. The fiscal note shows an impact for the 2019-21 biennium of revenues from other funds of $452 million.
Senator Patton.
Mr. President, Senate Bill 2336 comes to you from the Senate Finance and Tax Committee. The purpose of the bill is to raise the oil extraction tax from 5% to 6.5%. The oil extraction tax is one of the two primary taxes assessed on the gross value at the well of the oil extracted. The tax applies to every owner of the oil that is extracted, including royalty owners. The estimates of the tax generated under the existing 5% rate is about $2.2 billion for the 2019-2021 biennium. The fiscal note shows that this 15% increase in tax would generate an additional $452 million. The beneficiary entities of this tax are the tribe, the Legacy Fund, the Common Schools Trust Fund, and the Resources Trust Fund. When combined with the 5% gross production tax, existing law has a 10% tax on the gross revenue at the wellhead, and recent information shows that the state of North Dakota receives approximately 50% of its revenue from oil and gas taxes. I'm not aware of any other industries taxed as a percent of their gross revenue. This level of tax puts North Dakota above other oil-producing states such as Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Mr. President, the Senate Finance and Tax Committee voted 5-1 to recommend a do not pass on this bill for the following reasons. It would put us in one of the highest tax states in the nation regarding oil and gas production taxes. We are already highly dependent on this single source of revenue and therefore highly subject to the revenue cycles of this industry, and this would further reduce the diversity of our tax base. Testimony indicated that the first areas of production to be affected by this proposal would be the outer edges of the Bakken field and therefore would tend to shrink the activity to the true core production areas of the formation. This 15% tax increase would affect tens of thousands of North Dakota mineral owners. We also heard testimony that the average mineral owner is a 60-year-old female with receiving approximately $600 a month. Due to the steep decline curves of the wells, continued drilling is a must in order to maintain or increase the production of these wells. The result of fewer wells drilled will result in production declines within 1 to 2 years. It takes a great deal of capital to drill and produce these wells. North Dakota is in constant competition with other states and other oil fields for this capital. For these reasons, the Finance and Tax Committee, by a vote of 5-1, recommends a do not pass on Senate Bill 2336, and we ask your concurrence.
Is there any further discussion? Senator Dotson-Rott.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I was on the Tax Committee and was the one yes vote, and I would just like to make a few comments about this. We are fortunate to have an industry like the oil industry in our state. It's hard to imagine how we would function in a legislative session like we're having today without all the benefits and the things that have occurred in the population growth and the jobs and our economic growth without the oil industry. So we certainly appreciate the oil industry, and during the time of the boom when everything was going, we had the 6.5% oil extraction tax there. This tax was approved by the voters in an initiated measure in November of 1980. And we did have some good years early on there from roughly 81 to 86. Oil got up to $40 a barrel. And then around 86 and somewhere in there, the industry was in tough shape. Oil got down to $10 a barrel. And things were not good. I think our rig count around the state at that time was down to 6. And so the 1987 legislature passed a trigger tax break, which meant that if the price of oil dropped below a set trigger price, then the 6.5% oil extraction would go to zero. And I think it's pretty easy to sympathize with that 1987 legislature. And they had to do something with a rig count that low, prices that low, a lot of losses going on. And so they did. They did something big. They created this trigger tax that would allow that tax to go to zero when oil prices were low. We didn't get back above $40 a barrel until 2005. And then as the oil prices and the the oil prices and our North Dakota production really started to rise quite fast. And we were soon in an oil boom. And the good years continued through about 2014 and 15 timeframe when prices really dropped rapidly. So the 2015 legislature took the trigger mechanism that had been set up in 1987, which lowered that tax to zero and removed it, took it away. And at the same time then lowered the tax from the 6.5% down to 5%. And since that time, we've had kind of a circular debate that sort of continues here today. Did the oil industry get their taxes cut, or did they actually get a tax increase? And the loss of this tax break, and it was certainly a very important tax break, a very big one. The loss of that tax break meant that there would be more oil revenue for the state of North Dakota and more taxes paid by the oil industry. But I believe there was really no argument here in the legislature in 2015 that the trigger was no longer appropriate relative to the circumstances that existed in 1987. We had new technology, horizontal drilling, fracking, and there really the prospect of dry holes had just about gone away. So without that trigger in place and knowing that the oil extraction tax would stay in place and not drop to zero, should that oil extraction tax have been lowered as the legislature did, or should it have been left alone? This bill takes the position that the existing oil extraction tax of 6.5% should have been left alone, that we should have maintained the 6.5% and as it was passed by the voters. I think there are examples we can find where a very valuable tax break has been taken away and creates a tax increase for large interests. And at the same time, no rates have been adjusted. I'm thinking back to the days of the investment tax credit. It was a 10% tax credit. It was available to small businesses, large businesses, farmers. And the way it worked is you'd buy a machine, it had to be a new machine, and you'd get 10% of that value of the machine could be taken off as a credit on your income tax. And that was a pretty important thing. You could buy a machine for $50,000 at the end of the year and get 10% removed from your taxes. So whatever you owed in taxes, you could take 10% off that bill. Pretty important, pretty valuable. A lot of businesses used the investment tax credit. That was taken away. I don't remember what year it would have been. And there was no adjusting tax reduction. It was just a valuable tax incentive that was lost, and the rates stayed the same. So the idea that we need to compensate and offset, I don't know if that really holds up or not. I think we are fine, even with the revenues that we have today because of oil. We are struggling here to find the adequate funding for nursing homes, to keep up our infrastructure. We're creating bonding programs to do infrastructure. It seems to me we do have the needs here, and we are in a lot of these budgets trying to scrape to find where is the revenue going to come from. So I think that we maybe there's a lesson here for the future legislatures. That is, if you give a tax break, you need to be very careful about giving that tax break, because when the time comes that that tax break is no longer inappropriate, you may find that you're going to have to pay something to get that tax break removed. In this case, we removed a tax break, and in the process, we found we had to, or many of us felt, many in the legislature, that they had to lower the rate that was in place at the same time. So for that reason, and the fact that we had this measure passed by the voters, and I think it was appropriate. For that reason, I voted yes on the bill.
Is there any further discussion? Is there any further discussion, Senator Pepcorn?
Mr. President, I think everybody heard the fiscal impact of this bill when the Secretary read it. But if you didn't, take a look at it again using very conservative figures. This would be revenue of $450 million per biennium. And I think those are relatively conservative estimates. Over the interim, we were using, in developing various programs and funding programs and projecting, we were working on and realizing, of course, that oil prices vary from month to month. We were using the figure of 52.50 per barrel, 1.2 million barrels per month. At that rate, we'd be near $600 million per biennium with the restoration of the 6.5% tax, extraction tax, which, as the previous senator testified, has been in place since 1980 until the legislature lowered it in 2015. Taking a look at more recent figures, in September, the price of oil, $64.56, October, $64.60, then of course in November back down to $47.81, so it is volatile. But I think we're pretty safe in summarizing that revenue would be in that $450 to $550 million per biennium range. The senator who carried the bill did note that there are some primary designations for that tax money, including the tribal share, the legacy fund, and of course the Common Schools Trust Fund, the Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund, which would all benefit by tens of millions of dollars. And I think people realize the needs of K through 12 education here in this state. And also, let's take a look at the Resources Trust Fund. Now, the primary designation for that is, water projects and environmental projects. I think most of us realize that we're just looking at our emails coming in from the different water districts around the state. Most of them are up around the $50 million ask. Now, I ask the senators who are here, located in those various districts, they're asking for $50 million a year, and we do have the opportunity not to fulfill every request, but to take away a lot of the pain from several of them or all of the pain from some of these requests. The demands are great. We have the opportunity to fill them. Red River water supply, of course, getting water from the Missouri to Fargo area and the Red River Valley and other places along the way, $50 million. The Red River diversion, $50 million. Let's take a quick look at what this could mean to higher education. Let's not use this money necessarily to run the government, to pay our ongoing bills on a day-to-day basis. Let's look at it as investing in the future. NDSU and UND are premier research universities in the nation. We're looking at unmanned aerial vehicles, fine research. They'd like $100 million over the next 2 years, $50 million each, $25 million a year. Why don't we use this money that is we can come our way now to invest in the future and not concentrate on the patchwork, but concentrating on investing and broadening our economic base for the future, so we aren't so dependent on the one issue. More demands. The states in the State of the State speech, we learned that the state Supreme Court is asking for another judge. They lost how many seats in the 2015 biennium? They cut 55.5 positions, and we learned that the Supreme Court system isn't underwater, but it utilizes some breathing help. When it comes to terminology, it's how do you say it? How do you perceive it? It's been said that the actions of the 2015 legislature amounted to a $1 billion tax raise on the oil industry. Another point of view will say the state lost $500 million in revenue because of the actions. The tax raise angle comes from, had we not lowered that trigger, they wouldn't have paid anything. And so then that gets translated into a tax hike on the industry. On the other side, we're looking at it, we could have gotten rid of that trigger and maintained the 6.5%, and that would have maintained a healthier income flow. Now, that argument reminds me of a discussion I was having with my wife a few years ago in our front yard. It was over the height of grass. She goes, Merrill, it should be about this high. Maybe she's like 3 inches high. And I'm going, well, honey, it really only needs to be about 2 inches high. It's healthier for the grass. And it went on and on. Finally, I said, but honey, you're wrong. And she stamps her foot and looks at me and she goes, I know, but that doesn't make any difference. That's kind of like how it is when we're arguing with each other about whether it's a tax hike or whether really we're just giving up revenue. we have to look at it. We have to broaden that discussion a little bit. You know, Minnesota has 10,000 lakes, trees, some tourism there. They don't have that many fish in those lakes. We have 2 big lakes with a lot of fish. And we have oil. We have been blessed. We didn't do anything to get this oil. We just happen to be living here in North Dakota. Flyover country for so many years. But we have the oil. It's here. It's our resource. And yes, we appreciate, all of us appreciate the oil industry. Nearly all of us do, and for what it's done for the state. But it's also taken a toll on our state. And we can use this revenue, this extra 1.5% revenue, for the benefit of all North Dakotans. Just one final thing. We could go on and on, of course. I'll wrap it up. We heard the report from the engineers yesterday. It was in the news. You've seen it. We got an overall grade C. Bridges, a D+. Levees, roads, transit, everything could be improved. And especially still in oil country. I mean, I go out there all the time. I'm from Mountrail County, but we go out there all the time. I've seen the vast improvements. It's great. And we just need to keep working at it. And I don't know if we can spend too much on infrastructure, not only out there in West, just to maintain the business, but also for the benefit of the rest of the state. And so when we take a look at that, where the money could go, what it's being used for, I think it is a judicial judgment, and we can make great use of that money. And as far as the designations of these pots go, you know what? A lot of it's going to wind up in appropriations. A lot of it's going to be trickled down into that area, and where various groups can kind of battle it out for a little extra more money that's going to be in there for all of us to have access to. And with that, I thank you.
Senator Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. President, and hopefully this works better than the last time I had the mic in my hand. It sounds like it already is. First, I want to compliment the carrier or the senator from District 26. That was probably the best history recollection I've ever heard on this issue. So, thank you for doing that, and also the senator from District 44 on talking about perspectives. But I think some things need to come in as well that weren't part of the discussion so far, Mr. President. And one of the things is the removal of the exemptions, or removal of the triggers that occurred in the 2015 session. If you remember, the oil price went from a high of about $140 a barrel to $26 a barrel at that time. So we're having the same discussions in 2015 that they were having in 1987 about maintaining and protecting an industry presence in our state. And so I think that's important to the discussion as well at the time frame we were in. Also, Mr. President, remember too that part of that legislation, we discussed what was the actual effective rate of our tax of 11.5% at the time, which was 6.5% extraction tax. And in that discussion, we found out that because of exemptions granted to the industry on some well production, the actual effective rate was 11.1%, according to the tax department. So what we did in that legislation was we looked at the higher end of production intake by the industry and decided to also put in that bill a reverse trigger of $90 a barrel for 3 consecutive months, moves the extraction tax rate back up to 6%. So our rate at that point became 11% again if we get to that stage. It will reduce down again after 3 months of below $90 a barrel, but the point is, Mr. President, we made an accommodation that when the industry did better, so did the state. So it's important to note that we're still back to 11% if we get there. And then it was heard earlier today, Mr. President, that in a bill that we discussed earlier, that 50% of the state revenues are oil and gas tax revenue. We're adding more to that system when we do this bill. I know there's a lot of needs out there, but how much do you want to tax one horse at your trough for this government to operate? I think they pay a lot now, and I think we have the right balance between industry and government.
Senator Heckerman.
Mr. President, the passage of 2336 has deeper implications than just restoration of the oil extraction tax. It will change storefronts in North Dakota. It will change schools. It will enable state agencies to fully staff programs and projects. It will open doors for providers across the state to get essential services out to all North Dakotans. Taxation seems to be a word that everyone shies away from except when the topic comes to decreasing taxes. Decreasing taxes would be my hope if I knew that while we were doing so, we were able to provide all, and I mean all the services needed across the state. Because it is taxes and fees that make up the revenue stream that funds North Dakota. Over the summer and into late fall, I heard a lot about North Dakota being number one in several categories. I love North Dakota. You do too. And I'm proud to say that we are number one in a lot of categories. But today's local newspaper, as was just referenced by one of the speakers, also gives us pause to not be so quick to laud our accomplishments. The survey cited in the newspaper gives North Dakota a C in several categories: bridges, roads, drinking water, energy, levees, dams, transit, and wastewater. Seems like these are pretty essential systems to me. So how would we address that report? I would propose that the report gets addressed by putting money into those systems. It also seems that state roads are in poorer condition than county roads and township roads. We must do better. And to do better, we need to fund these systems. 95% of the dams in the state are high hazard dams. Bridges received a D+ rating, and 14% are identified as structurally deficient. Two ways to address the needs in North Dakota in the article were to raise the gas tax or to tap into the legacy fund. I would tell you that there is another way, and that is to restore the oil extraction tax to the level voted on by the people of North Dakota. What would a green vote do for North Dakota? A green vote on Senate Bill 2336 could do all of these things for your districts, your counties, your towns, your cities, and your families. It could adequately fund K-12 schools to not only teach content, but to also get our students college and career ready. An increasing need is to find funding to address issues of behavioral health, substance use, and suicide prevention in our schools. That takes trained individuals, collaborative programming, and increased funding. Your support could adequately fund to turn around out-migration of instructors in our higher education system. They're leaving due to cuts and to low morale because of uncertainty of whether there are funds available to provide job security. Your yes vote will be an effort to curb the tuition increases at our 11 campuses, which has increased at the same rate as some of the decreases in taxes the legislature has imposed. Your support could provide a revenue stream that funds long-term care. It could provide a revenue stream that addresses behavioral health needs across the state. It could help with infrastructure needs identified in the survey I just referenced. It could help long-term water systems across North Dakota, continued public health services, adequate law enforcement and emergency services, infrastructure transmission needs, workforce development, efforts to end homelessness, and programming and services for those with substance use disorders. Mr. President, the needs are huge across our state. It is our responsibility to meet those needs with adequate funding. We spend time working on expending the revenue, but we take little time in figuring out a plan to provide a stable funding stream for the future of this state. Here are some current funding streams we have pushed down to our political subdivisions by policies we adopt in the legislature. If you notice, cities are imposing increases in sales tax to meet their needs. Cities are levying additional mills and increasing property taxes. Cities and counties are increasing property values. Counties are increasing mill levies for some of their programs. Counties are now sharing services as cost savings continue with the hope that services remain adequate. Proposals are being made to repeal exemptions on farm residences. Proposals to tax grandma and grandpa in the nursing homes are being made. In addition, Mr. President, I propose that one solution to the workforce shortage is to provide essential services to families and individuals, whether it is a tangible or an intangible need. And by intangible, I mean those services that are exactly people services. Workers are not going to come to North Dakota if they're not adequate child care services. If communities do not have the basics necessary for good schools, for a grocery store, for a gas station, a pharmacy, an ambulance service, a clinic or a hospital. All those are essential in recruiting skilled workforce. We need a revenue stream to do this, and Senate Bill 2336 is the solution. The bottom line, Mr. President, is that this restoration of the extraction tax can help each and every legislative district, each and every city, each and every town, each and every county and township, and each and every individual and family across the state. Let's support the will of the people who put this important revenue stream for North Dakota in place in the first place. They were visionary and they stepped up to the task. Now let's also step up to the work that is before us. Let's vote green on 2336.
Senator Patton.
Mr. President, I was one time told when I was a county commissioner that the only fair tax is what someone else is paying. Right now we have approximately 50% of our revenue coming from the oil and gas industry for the state. I'm not sure what the appropriate level is. Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 70%? Broad-based public needs need to be supported by broad-based taxes. When you have broad-based needs supported by a narrow tax base, you're subject to the wild swings of the pricing, especially when commodities are involved. I'm sure that Finance and Tax could find $500 million in taxes someplace. We won't, but it would require us to tax the many who would receive the benefits. Right now we have a huge commitment from the oil and gas industry at 50% of our state revenue. That's enough for one industry.
Senator Cook.
Mr. President, I am well aware of the taxing philosophy of tax and spend. I'm well aware of the argument tax and spend could make. But my philosophy when it comes to tax policy is that a state's tax policy and a state's economy are connected at the hip. Good tax policy will drive an economy. Bad tax policy will slow an economy. Uncertain tax policy can destroy an economy. Mr. President, the tax bill that we passed in 2015 moved from not necessarily bad tax policy, but it made it better. It also removed a lot of uncertainty that was caused by the triggers, and that was important to the oil industry. Mr. President, I remember the days when our greatest export was our children. I remember all the talk that was going on of how we're going to keep our children here. Mr. President, that's not the case today. Our children have jobs in North Dakota. 97% of the working people in North Dakota are working. It's about the economy, Mr. President, and our economy is doing well, thanks to good tax policy.
Senator Wardner.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, I don't disagree with any of the comments that have been made, but I want to make sure that everybody understands one thing. We're in a competitive atmosphere with other oil plays in the United States. We're competing with the Permian in Texas, the Scoop and the Stack in Oklahoma. And as it was explained to me and as I've checked out, when it comes to royalties, we're in a better position than Texas. And that's the main state we compete with for investment dollars from the oil companies. But when it comes to taxes, we're above them by quite a bit. And then we have a third thing. They have a short distance to markets. We have a much longer distance, so the cost to transport is another factor that we have to consider in North Dakota. So when we moved that tax from 11.5 down to 10 for overall, it didn't put us in it put us in a better position as far as competing for tax dollars. And then when you have days like today, the oil companies would rather be in Texas drilling than up here in North Dakota. Now, there's no question There's no question, I have been told by people involved in the industry that 1.5% that we reduced it, and yes, we took the tax holiday away, and they had to pay during that time, but the biggest thing was there was certainty, and we were competing for their investment, and they were now ready to put more investment dollars in North Dakota. Now, there won't be any money for the services that we're talking about and we like in North Dakota if those companies don't invest here. And right now, I think we've got a nice balance, and we do have the oil companies investing in North Dakota to keep our oil play going. So, Mr. Chairman and members of the Senate, I would hope that you would defeat this bill.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, questions on the final passage of Senate Bill 2336. Secretary will open the key. Each senator will record their vote. Will the senators voted? Does any senator wish to change their vote? Secretary will close the key and take the tally. Final tally on Senate Bill 2336 reveals 10 ayes, 36 nays, 1 absent not voting. The bill is lost. Senator Klein.